โมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะพุทธังธัมมังสังฆังนะมัสสามิ Blessings, good evening. Somebody asked me today whether learning or memorizing Buddhist chanting will prevent them from getting Alzheimer's disease. I'm not a predictor of people's future health, so I think it takes more, or there are more factors involved in something like getting Alzheimer's than learning chanting or not. But certainly learning Buddhist chanting or memorizing it improves your memory. It's one way of training in mindfulness, this quality of paying attention, we say recollecting or keeping in mind. So if you're learning chanting, then you have to keep those words in mind until you can remember them. So that usually means a lot of repetition, keep going over and over them in your mind. Saying them out loud, and then of course letting go of everything else that may come up into your mind while you're memorizing the words of the chant or the sutta. So it certainly will have a good effect on your memory, on your brain. I think most of the research backs this up, that if you keep learning new things through your life, that does have a good effect on your brain. Whatever your karma is, whether you have the karma to get a particular degenerative disease like Alzheimer's or dementia, that will depend on many other factors as well. But all of us suffer from memory loss as we get older. Memory doesn't function so well, so chanting, and particularly chanting or memorizing the words of the Buddha, does seem to have a good effect on people's mind. It's not just the memorization as such, but it's also the fact that these are words from an enlightened Buddha. And we revere the Buddha, hold the Buddha up as our teacher. I would say the wisest person who ever lived in the world. And the words of the Buddha, we call the Dhamma. These teachings have a certain purity and a certain power because they're the truth. And they're coming from an enlightened mind, an awakened mind. Because they are pointing to the truth, it brings up very good qualities in the mind as you're memorizing them. So memorizing chanting, and when you're actually chanting, it particularly brings up faith, which is a very wholesome, good quality. It tends to bring up energy, energizes your mind. It may bring up some joy. So that has a very good effect on our mind. Often it helps you to reflect on the truth as you're chanting or as you're memorizing, so it also brings you some understanding and wisdom. And of course it brings you mindfulness. As you put effort into memorization, you're being mindful of those words. So all of these have a good effect on your mind, just as when you practice meditation. So really chanting and learning chanting is a form of meditation, mental training. And that will, at the very least, give you some good qualities to rely on as you get older. And if you do have to face any illnesses such as Alzheimer's, well, it's not going to harm your chances of dealing with such an illness. I have been to visit people with Alzheimer's before who were Buddhist and had a background in Buddhist faith and learned to meditate and learned chanting, learned suttas earlier on in their life before they got Alzheimer's. And when they meet monks and the monks chant a blessing, or for instance, seems to brighten their mind, at least briefly. They have a little bit of brightness, happiness arise, stimulates some good qualities, maybe some long lost memory is stimulated at that time. So again, nothing is lost by learning chanting and training yourself in that way. And there are some monks who train their memory to the point they can remember the entire Buddhist canon, the Tripitaka, 91 volumes, which is an amazing feat. They say those with good memory, maybe one of the karmic consequences is in the future life when they, or in that life, when they attain samadhi, if they attain fourth jhana and gain abhinya, psychic powers, then they often gain the ability to remember or recollect past lives. We even had that, one or two people who, or children, who can remember how to chant from a very early age, and usually the explanation is given that they learnt chanting in a previous life, and then some of that memory carries over into this life. So 5 years old and they can already chant a sutta like the Dhammacakka Sutta, when they haven't even been maybe to a temple or learnt that sutta yet. I first got enthusiastic to learn chanting when I was an anagarika, a white-robed anagarika in Thailand. I became an anagarika at Wat Pananachat many years ago, and within a few weeks of becoming anagarika, they sent me to a branch monastery where there were hardly any monks and they were struggling for support. They needed someone to offer things, offer food and drinks, because there were no lay visitors at that temple monastery. It was on an island in a reservoir, the Sirinton Reservoir, which is right on the border with Laos. And it's a branch monastery of Ajahn Kalyano. It's a peninsula, but it was as if an island because there was no road into the monastery. It was surrounded by water. And there were just 3 monks living there at that time. And I was an anagarika, and I was sent there. The day I left Wat Pananachat to go and stay there, one of the monks said, "Oh, you're off to the Wild West. You better be careful, it's really dangerous there. The forest is big and there's lots of wild animals and there's people wandering around with guns because it's right on the border." And I said, "Did you know that this monastery is actually in the easterly direction?" I said, "It's the east, so I should be fine. It's not the Wild West." That was my answer. Anyway, they sent me off there and I had to learn to drive a boat, one of those long boats that you get on the Chao Phraya River in Bangkok, if you've ever seen them, with a long outboard motor. That's how the monks got around from their island across to the mainland to get food every morning. And I had to learn to drive the boat. And then one day there was an invitation to a house on the edge of the water on the mainland. Ajahn Chah's niece was getting married. And so they invited all the senior monks to come. There were maybe 15 or 20 senior disciples of Ajahn Chah, all the monks like Lumpur Liam, Lumpur Thun and Lumpur Kun, other monks who've been here over the years. They were all there. And then there was me sitting at the end of the line, this white-robed Anagarika. And because it was such an auspicious occasion, they chanted the Paritas, the verses of protection. And of course, they're all senior monks, and they chanted very well, very loudly, and they didn't forget their lines. There's a very good energy. You always get a good energy when you get lots of monks chanting together. But there was me at the end of the line in white, couldn't chant a word. I could chant Namo Tassa Bhagavato, but I couldn't chant the Paritas yet, because I'd only just become an Anagarika. I hadn't had time to learn them. So I was a bit embarrassed because I couldn't join in the chanting. I just had to sit there in silence. But it was a good lesson, because that day I was so ashamed that I couldn't do the chanting. I said, I better learn this. I'm going to have to learn this before I become a novice monk. And that would be the next step in my training. So I went back to the monastery to learn the Paritas after that. But also on that day, the senior monks all came across in the boat. I had to drive them across the water in the boat, and they had a day in the monastery walking around the forest, enjoying the beautiful forest there. It was actually Ajahn Chah's favourite spot before he became ill. He liked to go and stay there because it's such a big forest full of animals, and there was surrounded by water. So it's quite a beautiful spot. And we took all the visiting monks around. And then before they left, I offered them all drinks at the meditation hall. It's just a little wooden meditation hall in the forest. And I offered Lumpur Liam a drink, and as I was sitting next to him, having offered the drink, he said to me in perfect English, because I couldn't speak any Thai then, he said, "You must learn to speak Thai every day." And he said it perfectly. So it was like a double whammy. For a second time, I was really ashamed. It's like I couldn't speak any Thai, but he could speak perfect English. So not only did I fail in the chanting, I failed in the test of speaking Thai. So I made a second resolution. I said, I must learn Thai. I sent the monks back in the boat, and then I went back to the forest, which was very quiet. I spent the rest of my time there until I became a novice monk, learning these chants and learning to speak Thai. And there were some Thai monks living there, so they could help me. And learning another language or learning chanting certainly doesn't not help your memory. It improves your memory, and maybe it can boost your health, mental health, physical health, brain health. And it also boosts your meditation, because when you learn and memorize chanting, you're practicing mindfulness and learning to let go of everything else. What stops you from memorizing something, learning a language, learning a verse or a sutta, or your own distracted states of mind is what stops you. You become distracted thinking about other things, or you become lazy or bored or fed up, or whatever it may be. Something takes your mind away from the task of learning, memorizing. So it's actually a very good way of training your mind in meditation. One of the monks at the monastery at that time, he was learning the Patimokkha, which is another chant that we learn as monks. And yesterday we chanted it here. It takes about 45 minutes. You chant from memory. Some monks can chant very quickly, maybe just 30 minutes. Some monks are slower, maybe 60 minutes, but on average about 45 minutes from memory. Not allowed to read it. So again, it's a chant that trains your mindfulness, trains your memory. And the monk there who was learning it, he'd learn it all night long. Each of the monks, we were camping in the forest in our we had an umbrella and mosquito net and just set up in the forest. It was a huge forest, thousands of acres. But I'd hear this monk, especially on the full moon nights where it's very clear and dry, not raining, he'd be out there walking up and down on his walking meditation path, practicing, memorizing the Patimokkha chant. At 1 a.m., 2 a.m. you'd hear this sound of the monk chanting in the forest. So not only does it help you boost your memory, it helps deal with sleepiness. It's a good way to deal with feelings of dullness, apathy, sleepiness. But as you become mindful, say learning chanting or practicing meditation, one thing you learn is, become aware of, is that suffering is as an experience. You experience it in the mind, don't you? The Four Noble Truths of the Buddha's teaching on suffering and its cause, and then the end of suffering and the path leading to the end of suffering. And these Four Noble Truths, although we practice with this body that we use to do things, but they arise in the mind. Understanding, knowing suffering is something you do in the mind, with the mind. You need to be mindful to recognize suffering. You need to be mindful to pay attention and then to contemplate or examine the truth of what's going on in your mind, to get to know the nature of suffering. And that's a truth, isn't it? A noble truth. And the truth is something you know, you come to know and realize. But when the Buddha was saying you should know the truth of suffering, what he means is know it with your heart, with your mind. Not simply as a memory, or a theory, or a belief, or a view. In the beginning we do that because we hear the teaching or we read it, and if it makes sense, then you can use the words and what you remember from the teaching as a starting point. When the Buddha said no suffering, he meant you have to practice mindfulness, pay attention to your body, your mind, and particularly to what's going on in your mind, and know suffering as it arises, as an experience. To have enough clarity, enough stability of mind, and to pay enough attention so that you can see the experience of suffering. That may also include physical suffering, or the pain of the body, but also mental suffering, stress, negativity, unhappiness in all its forms. And that leads straight on to the second noble truth of knowing and understanding what is the cause of suffering. Recognizing that. It's another truth that you have to know by paying attention to your own mind. And the Buddha's description was that suffering is caused by craving. Where does craving come from? It comes from ignorance, avijja. Vicca means knowledge, avijja means the opposite, so not knowing. Which is why in order to understand the Four Noble Truths, you have to have mindfulness to pay attention to see the truth of your experience. Because the opposite of the truth is falsehood, delusion, or ignorance, not knowing. So you need the mindfulness and the clarity, the clear comprehension, and then the wisdom, the insight, to show you the truth, to reveal the truth. As you become more aware of your own mind, it reveals that there is ignorance, which leads to the arising of craving, which leads to the arising of attachment, clinging. Clinging is really just multiple craving. Falling into different kinds of craving, liking, disliking, wanting, not wanting, over and over again, repeatedly, hardens the pathways of the mind, the channels of the mind into attachment, clinging. This is the second noble truth, that as you become more aware, more mindful, and you pay attention to your mind, you start to realize this is the source of my suffering. Another word we use for craving is defilement, kilesa. So we say mental defilements are the cause of suffering. So whether you call it craving or defilement, it's those thoughts rooted in greed, anger, delusion. Ultimately, all the thoughts rooted in ignorance and delusion. What tends to come out as either greed, attraction, or aversion. And that's the cause of suffering. And you can only really know that as an experience by paying attention, practicing awareness. You may be paying attention by learning chanting, memorizing chanting. And as you're doing that, you have a thought come up. I don't like this, I'm bored with this, I don't want this. Or the opposite, I want something else. I'm bored chanting, I want my drink, my food. I want to look at my phone, I want to talk to my friend. I want something other than what I've got. These are examples of craving or mental defilement, and they may come up as you're trying to memorize a chant. You'll have endless opportunities to gain insight into the Four Noble Truths. And with craving, clinging, with mental defilements, the Buddha said these are to be abandoned. Because if they're the cause of suffering and you don't want suffering, you don't want more pain, more disappointment, despair, agitation, stress, if you don't want more suffering, then the only way out to deal with it is to abandon the cause of suffering, which is craving, wanting. So every time you notice craving, wanting, mental defilement arising, and you recognize it as what it is, because you're seeing it as it is with the mind that is clear, paying attention, then the next thing to do, and the next task you might say, is to abandon it. Let it go. Stop following the craving. Don't indulge it. Don't give it space in your mind. As the Buddha said, we suffer because we give space in our mind to the causes of suffering, the mental defilements, the craving. Another way you could say it is we welcome them in. We welcome in the greed, the anger, the jealousy, the fear, the worry, the confusions, all the different kinds of mental suffering. We welcome it into our mind by welcoming in the causes of it, the craving. If we're a bit more aware, pay more attention, we can decide to say, no, I'm letting you go, you're not coming into my mind. Or if you've been in my mind, I'm letting you out now, off you go. So if you're learning chanting, then that's the moment when you go back to memorizing the word or the phrase or the sentence and stop following the craving. You give more importance at that moment to the memorization of the word, the phrase, and less importance to the craving, to the mental defilement. So because you're giving less importance to it, it fades out from your mind. When it fades away, you experience a little moment of cessation of suffering, which is the third noble truth, nirodha. Again, that's something you have to experience. It's a truth. It's a reality that you have to experience by training your mind to observe, pay attention, And then do the right thing, which is abandon craving. When you've noticed it, when you've recognized it, take it out. As Ajahn Chah used to say all the time, you eat fish, you want the meat, you don't want the bones, so you take the bone out whenever your teeth bite down on a bone. It's unpleasant, so you put your fingers up and pick the bone out. Whenever you notice craving, defilement, it's unpleasant in its nature, so you take it out. But not with your fingers. That's a mental action of letting go. And that may be by putting your attention on something better, like the word that you're memorizing for that chant. So just in a few minutes of memorizing chanting or a sutta or a verse, you're experiencing the noble truth of suffering, the cause of suffering, and then the cessation of suffering. The act of letting go is the fourth noble truth. In the cultivation of mindfulness, insight, awareness, understanding, and all the other factors of the path support that. You're practicing right livelihood, practicing precepts, virtuous conduct, supports the development of mindful awareness, which supports the letting go of the kilesa. That's why the fourth noble truth, the path, has all these factors, because they all support each other. Ajahn Chah used to call the Four Noble Truths sometimes just the Dhamma. So when your mind is with the Dhamma, you see suffering and its cause, and you let go of the cause because you know it's leading you to suffering, so you don't want it. Your mind is with the Dhamma. When you forget yourself, you're no longer mindful. You're not mindful of the chanting, if that's what you're doing. When you forget yourself, then you can't know or see the Four Noble Truths in that moment. So he said it's like you go crazy for a few moments. You forget the Dhamma, you forget mindfulness for a few moments. Your mind has gone wild for a few moments. Or he said it's like having a tiger in your mind. When you're the tiger tamer, you're the guy with whatever the equipment is, or the means to tame the tiger. When you're there, then the tiger is well behaved. But when you lose your awareness, it's like that tiger goes wild. And then all the defilements and the craving come back into your mind. Greed, anger, worry, fear, delusion. So say you're memorizing chanting, or you're meditating, whether it's walking meditation, sitting meditation, you'll have those moments when your mind goes a bit wild. And suddenly a strong emotion comes up, takes over, a whole train of thought pulls you away. Sometimes it's powerful emotions, fear, worry, desire. Sometimes just more subtle mumbling, grumbling in the back of your mind, all those kind of small random thoughts popping into your mind. But when you're not mindful, not aware, the craving, the clinging takes over. The tiger takes over. It takes you away into a different realm, the realm of not truth. It's far away from the Four Noble Truths, from the Dhamma. It's the not truth. So they say, when you're lost in your daydreams, you're thinking about something, but unmindfully, you know something at that point. It's not like there's nothing going on, but you're knowing wrongly, because you don't really see or know the Four Noble Truths in that moment if you're not mindful. So say you follow a train of thought based on aversion or irritation, or you're lost in some desire, some fantasy of something you want. you're half aware of what's going on. It may bring you some pleasure or may bring you some suffering, but you're not fully aware of the Four Noble Truths. So you're knowing wrongly at that moment. You're actually feeding more ignorance, more craving, because of the lack of awareness. Craving feeds clinging, so you feed more greed or attachment, more aversion, more fear, more worry. By the lack of mindfulness, we feed more ignorance, which feeds into more craving. So it's a cycle. We make karma and then we receive the fruits of karma. Luang Por Chah often would say, if you narrow the practice right down to seeing or recognizing the Four Noble Truths in your mental behavior at any one time, you could narrow it down right to the point where you're just experiencing pleasant and unpleasant feelings arising from moment to moment. So maybe you think of something that brings you pleasure or something that brings you some mental pain, or it could be external stimulation from your senses. You see something desirable, enjoyable, pleasant, and gives you pleasant feeling. You see something that you associate with pain, it's ugly, you get painful feeling. And if we're not mindful at that moment, the pleasant feeling, the unpleasant feeling stimulates more craving, more attachment. So the place where you're really seeing or knowing the Four Noble Truths, or the truth of life, is at that moment where you experience feeling, pleasant, unpleasant, or we say neutral, neither pleasant nor unpleasant. And that's where you can see the Four Noble Truths in action, if you're applying yourself to them, to the practice. So maybe even just as you're meditating, trying to establish mindfulness with the aim of understanding the Four Noble Truths better, but then you have a moment where you lose your mindfulness and you feel frustrated. Or you're memorizing some chanting and you forget. You put a lot of effort into memorizing something, and then as you're reciting it to yourself, chanting it along, you forget. And then in the next moment, because you forget, you become irritated with yourself or frustrated. Partly that's because you have the desire, you want to be able to chant or recite that verse. So there's some craving, wanting to be successful in chanting or do it well, do it properly. But then you have a moment of lapse of mindfulness, so you haven't achieved what you set out to do, so then you go into aversion. So something as simple as memorizing a few words of chanting can be a micro insight into the Four Noble Truths. At that moment, you're seeing suffering arising because you slip into craving as a reaction to forgetting something. So if you want a good preparation for the end of life, when you're bound to forget things, you don't even need to go to the end of your life to forget things. You can forget any day of the week. You can forget things. But a good way to prepare for forgetfulness and how to deal with it so that you don't experience unnecessary or additional suffering is, we'll practice mindfulness, but then also reflect on the Four Noble Truths and use them that way. So when you're becoming forgetful, you know, this is another experience. Maybe it's stimulated by aging and there's nothing you can do about it, so you're becoming forgetful in a situation. Or maybe it's just a lapse of mindfulness, you're not paying attention, you're distracted, scattered. But if you reflect on the Four Noble Truths at that moment, rather than going into aversion or annoyance because you're forgetful, you just maintain awareness and go, I forgot. and you don't create any suffering out of it. It's just like that. Forgetfulness is like this. It feels like this. It's not pleasant, it's not helpful, but it's the way it is in that moment. And when your mind is with Dhamma, with the Four Noble Truths, you're seeing the way it is. So you know, oh, it's like this. Forgetfulness is like this. And if you're unfortunate, you have a real downturn in your mental health, or you start to experience loss of memory as you get older, then you have to keep applying the Four Noble Truths to that. So, oh, it's like this, I forget. And you can accept it because you know this is the way things are. Knowing the Four Noble Truths may or may not improve your memory, but at least it will help you stop you suffering about the memory loss. It also brings up compassion, because the more you understand your own mind and see these Four Noble Truths, then you realize these are universal experiences, universal qualities that apply to other people as well. So maybe you have an elderly relative or friend who's suffering memory loss. And if you've paid attention, studied your own mind, and you're understanding the Four Noble Truths better for yourself, then when you experience your friend's memory loss, you're less likely to get irritated or annoyed with them. Because you know exactly what's going on. You've seen it in yourself. Oh, I have lost my memory. I forgot things before. And you can accept it without creating more stress, without going to the aversion or creating suffering out of it. Then when they do it, you just know, oh, they're having that same problem. So it gives rise to compassion. Wisdom, meaning seeing the Dhamma, seeing the Four Noble Truths, gives rise to wisdom, which translates into compassion for other people when they have memory loss. Rather than putting them down or getting annoyed, angry with them, scolding them, you just go, oh, it's like this. Just as I lose my memory, they lose their memory. That's the way the human experience is. As the brain gets older, sometimes we lose our memory. It slows down. There's many other things that happen as well. You lose mobility, so you're not so steady on your feet. Your joints hurt, and you're just standing up, sitting down is harder. You're not able maybe to concentrate, you're not maybe able to move your body so well to do different kinds of tasks or activities. If you contemplate the Four Noble Truths, it can help you to deal with that wisely and with understanding, rather than just reacting with aversion or frustration, whether it's yourself or somebody else near you. So as the Four Noble Truths come together in the mind and you train yourself so that you're seeing in this way, you're using it as a way to look at your experience, maybe the insight is simply, oh, that's the way it is, or it's like that. It helps you to accept the truth of things. Doesn't mean to say you stop and give up and stop training your memory or practicing mindfulness, but when you have these problems, you can accept them as just the way it is, because you have had insight into the Four Noble Truths. And you understand real suffering is not out there to blame somebody or something. And suffering comes when we lose our insight into the Four Noble Truths and we start following craving again. And that's a personal thing. It's going on in your own mind. There's no one else you can blame. And even yourself, if you're getting older, maybe you have to accept you have moments of, you have your your moments of agedness, a senior's moment. Of course, you can have a senior's moment when you're very young as well. It's not necessarily for just the oldies. But you can accept it, and you can have compassion for yourself, for others. You understand better what's going on. But you don't create craving out of it, create suffering out of it. You just know, oh, that's the way it is. An old body is like this, a lapse of memory is like this, a lapse of mindfulness is like this. But you don't go to aversion or frustration. You just understand, oh, that's the way it is. And this is why the Buddhist teachings are so useful for human beings, because they point us directly to look and reflect on human experience, whoever you are, wherever you are, whatever your background, your culture, your race, your gender. It doesn't matter, because these are just basic human experiences that we all have to go through. Question is, do we use the wisdom that the Buddha was pointing to, or do we just follow craving? If you follow craving, then you're back with suffering again. Lost. Despairing. Sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, despair. Soka parideva dukkha domana supayas. If you do that chanting every day, the morning chanting, we chant what is suffering? Not getting what you want is suffering. Getting what you don't want is suffering. In short, not getting your wishes fulfilled is suffering. Birth is suffering, aging is suffering, sickness is suffering, death is suffering, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, despair are suffering. If you chant that regularly, then when it comes up in your experience, you go, yeah, I know that. I was chanting about that before. Now I can see what the Buddha was talking about. You get some insight from that, just using those chants. Monks do this all the time. Not in a cold or callous way, but just recognizing the truth in a situation. So, somebody makes a mistake, gets annoyed, frustrated, and then another monk chimes in with Soka parideva dukkha domana supayas. Yes, back to the Four Noble Truths. These teachings are here to help us. They're not here to confuse us or complicate life. They're actually helping us to understand better what's going on in our minds. See, the suffering is it's not even a person. When you're suffering, it's just a quality or a characteristic of mind coming from ignorance, conditioning, craving. There's no one you can blame, really. It's just mental defilements at work, and this is what they do. They're just doing their duty. And they're doing what they do. They're very good at it. And they're very good at causing us suffering. So there's no need to get angry or upset. You just say, craving. It's like this. This is what it does to a human mind. But when I establish mindfulness, let go of the craving, that suffering stops. That's what I need to do. No need to suffer with it. No need to blame anyone. You just practice. So maybe I'll leave you with those reflections tonight.